the Chinese had no evidence to give anyone in support of natural emergence. And that, I think, is when the sort of balance of perceptions began to change.
Not only that, but all of the records from the Wuhan Institute of Virology are missing. They closed down all their databases, and they essentially have sealed up that lab, and they will not produce any of the experimentation or the post-experiment documentation that you would expect that if the lab was innocent of experimenting with this virus, that they would provide.
Yes, that's right. I think one has to be a little careful in interpreting the government's behavior. I mean, they're certainly acting guilty, but they're an authoritarian regime, after all.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. The pandemic, 150 million cases, over 3 million deaths. And we still seem no closer to understanding, how did COVID begin? Where did it come from? We know it seemed to start in Wuhan, China, the same place where the Chinese have a laboratory that was carrying out gain-of-function experiments on bat viruses with US funding. Gain-of-function is a way of making natural viruses stronger, to see how they may mutate and possibly jump from animals to humans. And that lab was experimenting with coronaviruses. Both COVID-19 and SARS are caused by coronaviruses. The virus that causes SARS is known as SARS-CoV, while the virus that causes COVID-19 is known as SARS-CoV-2. The trail to and from that lab is astonishing, even though the Chinese government has tried to deny the Wuhan Institute of Virology was involved. There were sick miners, several of whom died from working in a bat cave in China, and their virus samples were taken to that lab. The lab had a strange outbreak of pneumonia amongst its workers before the official COVID outbreak was announced. The first cases of COVID were close to the lab, within meters, in fact. The lab took down its online database in September, months before the COVID cases were announced in December. They claimed they had been hacked. And hospitals along the subway line from the lab to the Wuhan airport had the first clusters of cases, according to experts. As you're about to hear on this backstory, there are so many clues pointing to a lab leak, it's astonishing. And the Chinese, of course, deny everything. Joining me now from New Jersey is Nicholas Wade, and he is a science writer who has worked on Nature, Science, and the New York Times, and is now an author. Welcome, Nicholas.
Thank you.
Look, this is a heck of an essay you've written, and I've read it not once, but 3 times now, because it's a lot to take in. But let's begin with really where you leave us, and that is that there is simply no reasonable explanation, natural explanation for COVID-19, aside from the fact that all roads lead to the laboratory in Wuhan, and that it was likely created or at least experimented with there and escaped from there.
Well, the way I look at it is more or less just as you said, but it's I think formally one should acknowledge there are sort of 2 possible hypotheses on the table, and then when you look at which explains the evidence better on what we've got, I would say that the lab escape scenario explains the available facts much better.
Proponents of the natural emergence, that means it didn't come from the lab, but it came from maybe a bat cave, or have a rather harder story to tell. The plausibility of their case rests on a single surmise, the expected parallel between the emergence of SARS-2 and that of SARS-1 and MERS, but none of the expected evidence for such a parallel history has emerged. No one has found the bat population that was the source of SARS-2, if indeed it ever infected bats. No intermediate host has presented itself, despite an extensive search by Chinese authorities that included the testing of 80,000 animals. Tell me on natural emergence, while you put it out there, there just doesn't seem to be any evidence that it came from a bat or came from a cave or came from a wild animal market.
Right. There's none of the evidence you'd expect to see if it followed the pathway of its two predecessors, the SARS-1 epidemic and the MERS epidemic. And both of them left a lot of evidence in nature. You could see the intermediate host animals, civets in one case, camels in the other. You could see the human populations in which the virus sort of adapted itself until it was a real pathogen. None of that is there with SARS-2, and I think everyone expected to find it. So that's why this WHO commission to Beijing was so interesting. It seemed at first sight a propaganda victory for the Chinese, since they controlled the commission, and the commissioners came away saying lab escape very, very doubtful. But in fact, the real message was the Chinese had no evidence to give anyone in support of natural emergence. And that, I think, is when the sort of balance of perceptions began to change.
Not only that, but all of the records from the Wuhan Institute of Virology are missing. They closed down all their databases, and they essentially have sealed up that lab, and they will not produce any of the experimentation or the post-experiment documentation that you would expect that if the lab was innocent of experimenting with this virus, that they would provide.
Yes, that's right. I think one has to be a little careful in interpreting the government's behavior. I mean, they're certainly acting guilty, but they're an authoritarian regime, after all. They did clamp down on information after the SARS-1 epidemic. So for them sort of to clamp down after SARS-2, at first blush, at least, it's just sort of routine behavior on their part. On the other hand, they've done so in such a specific way. As you mentioned, they've closed down all the viral databases. They've prevented scientists from speaking. They've put out a dribble of information which may be designed to mislead or misdirect. Their behavior certainly gives no support whatever to the natural emergence theory.
I think it's really probably misleading if I keep talking around conspiracy theories or what they didn't do, because it's really important to focus, as your essay did, in an amazing way. You did a lot of research, focused on what they were doing. They were, and could you explain it to me, absolutely experimenting with a SARS-2-like virus, and they were experimenting on strengthening those viruses for what purpose, which is controversial in itself.
Right. They were doing what is blandly called a gain-of-function experiment. So in the last 20 years, virologists have learned how to soup up viruses, and it was a very attractive thing for them to do, and it gains lots of research money. And the justification of this program is that it's very important for us to try and catch these pandemics ahead of time before a virus leaps from an animal host to humans, like the Ebola virus or whatever. And we can do it in the lab, say the virologists, if you let us sort of take a virus and tweak it a little and see just what tweaks are necessary to allow it to infect humans. Now, if we do that, then that'll give us a leg up on where nature's going to go next. So that is the rationale under which virologists all over the world, not just in China, have been souping up these viruses in gain-of-function. And that is exactly what the Chinese were doing with these coronaviruses. You see, after the SARS-1 and MERS epidemics, both of which were caused by coronaviruses, everyone got very interested in knowing, well, where is the next pandemic going to strike? So Dr. Shi Zhengli, who is the leading bat coronavirus at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, she started work with a well-known coronavirologist in the University of North Carolina, Ralph Barrett, and the two of them started souping up coronaviruses largely by swapping in spike proteins from one coronavirus into the backbone of another. And they had an NIH grant to do so. Amazingly, the NIH was funding these experiments by Dr. Xi at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
This is American funding of experiments in China.
Right. The National Institutes of Health was funding Dr. Xi to do these experiments. And that's how we know she was doing them. It's all in her grant proposal. Or rather, the grant proposal goes not directly to her. It goes to something called the Eco Health Alliance in New York, headed by Dr. Peter Daszak. And he then subcontracts the grant to Dr. Xi. These grant applications are a matter of public record. And you can see that Dr. Xi plans to soup up coronaviruses to see if they can attack humans. Now, she doesn't use human subjects, that would be unethical, but scientists instead use various surrogates. They use either human cells growing in culture, or they use humanized mice. That's a mouse where you've taken out something called the ACE2 receptor, which is a protein that studs the cells of human airways. And you take out the mouse version and you put in the human version. So all these genetically engineered mice are like little humans as far as their airways are concerned. So she was testing these souped up viruses in humanized mice and human cells. This was exactly the track you'd be on if you were going to create a SARS-2-like virus. So either she created the SARS-2 virus itself or something pretty like it.
Why don't we know? Why are the records not? I mean, the Chinese government doesn't want to release the records, but why don't we know?
Well, we know for, I guess, three reasons. Firstly, we know from the grant proposals, the NIH grant proposals, which are a matter of public record, that say exactly what she was going to do. We know from a paper she published in 2017, where she'd reported swapping in the spike proteins into 4 viruses and creating 4 of these hybrid viruses. And we know because of Dr. Daszak himself, who just before news of the pandemic hit in December 2019, gave an interview in which he enthused about how well these experiments were going in cooking up novel coronaviruses that could infect humanized mice. Of course, he sang a very different tune as soon as the virus had, as we think, escaped, but that's what he said before the escape.
It's important to note that Daszak, the president of the Eco Health Alliance, was sort of the person who came out and told the world's media, don't look at the lab. The lab couldn't be involved, and he declared that in the Lancet, I understand, right? But he obviously had competing interests because he was involved in the research.
Yes, I think he had an enormous competing interest, which should have been declared in that Lancet letter, and in fact was not. And indeed, the letter concludes by saying, we declare no competing interests.
Can you give me something on this bat cave, where all of these coronavirus samples my understanding, had come from? And in fact, they had miners who had been in the cave. Some of them got sick, some of them died, and that health information was then covered up as well.
Yes, this is a very interesting story, not least because it's clear the Chinese tried to conceal it. The whole purpose of Dr. Xi's research was to find dangerous coronaviruses that might attack the human population. So when these 6 miners died, presumably she and Dr. Daszak were right on the case. It was of intense interest to them. That's what they were looking for all along. So she analyzed 8 viruses from this cave. They were not directly from the miners' blood, but they were bat viruses from the cave. Mm-hmm. And she published just little snippets of them, not the whole virus. It was harder to sequence things in those days. But what people did was to just sequence one gene as a kind of index to the virus as a whole. So she called one of these viruses she had a bat coronavirus 4991. So then nothing more was heard about that very interesting virus until you sort of fast forward to the present time, when the Chinese, presumably they need to establish that the SARS-2 virus was not a lab creation, it came from a bat. So they needed to establish a nice sort of family tree for it. So they needed to put out there a sort of ancestor that was sort of close enough to SARS-2 to look like it was a sort of close ancestor, but not so close that anyone would claim SARS-2 had been derived from it. So lo and behold, Dr. Shi publishes, I forget when this was, in January, February, she publishes a new bat virus she has called RATG13, and it fulfills exactly the role I described to you. It establishes a sort of true bat genealogy for SARS-2, but it's not too close to it. Well, then people started ferreting around, and they found that this RATG13 was in fact identical to the one isolated 8 years before from the Yunnan cave that you mentioned. It was identical with what she'd called bat coronavirus 4991, except in her paper with the RATG13, she made no mention of the earlier finding. So that is a no-no in scientific terms. You don't just sort of switch names on something you're studying. You can switch the name if you want, but you need to say to your readers, this is what I'm doing. And she didn't. So this is why everyone has been very interested in this virus and exactly what the Chinese were trying to accomplish in publishing it.
Does the evidence seem to point towards the cave as being where this virus originated from, and that she then generated SARS-2 from something she found in that cave?
Yes. Under the lab escape hypothesis, we have no evidence anyway that SARS-2 was ever inside a bat. In other words, it could be a totally artificial virus. Now, if it is a totally artificial virus, the way it would have been created is just the way we see from her previous published experiments with Ralph Baric. She would have taken the backbone of one coronavirus, and she would have inserted into it the spike proteins from various other coronaviruses. So the spike proteins are very important because they define what kind of host the virus will attack. And so one of these viruses she had created, they probably all used the backbones from the cave we discussed, and she would have spliced different spike protein genes into them, and one of them probably or very possibly was the SARS-2 virus.
How common are lab escapes? How common do viruses get out of labs? They are much more common than we realize.
Yeah, they're kind of horrifyingly common. There's about one or two escapes a year that we know of, and maybe others that don't get reported. So even the smallpox virus, which is one of the most deadly pathogens you can think of, escaped from labs in England in the 1970s. More recently, the SARS-1 virus, that's of 2003, escaped 4 times from the Beijing Institute of Virology. It's a real hard virus to contain.
I should be asking you what hasn't escaped then. The
Yes.
Wuhan Institute of Virology, it says, has a new BSL-4 lab, which I understand that's like one of the top security labs in terms of locking down virus. But its state of readiness considerably alarmed the State Department inspectors who visited it from the Beijing embassy in 2018. It didn't have appropriately trained technicians and investigators to operate a high containment laboratory. And as a result, probably a lot of scientists in China didn't want to work in that lab because it's also very uncomfortable to work in those, how would you describe it? In, the full suit, very restrictive, uncomfortable, physically uncomfortable labs.
Right. Virologists really don't like working in BSL-4 conditions, and as you say, the people, the State Department guys who inspected the Wuhan Institute of Virology BS4 lab found lots of deficiencies. However, in a way, that's all beside the point because Dr. Shi did not do any of her work in BSL-4 conditions. They were all done in BSL-2 and 3. So BSL-2 is really almost nothing. It's very, very minimal safety conditions. Basically, you put up a sign saying biohazard, and you try and remember not to suck up fluids through a pipette, as virologists like to do. That's it. It's hard to. It's the level of of a dentist's waiting office in one description.
You're kidding me.
Not a waiting office. It's just a dentist's office in the US will follow BSL-2 safety guidelines.
I'm told that there were people who worked in that lab that got ill just before the COVID-19 outbreak was announced by the Chinese government. Is that right?
Well, this comes from the intelligence side. So the U.S. intelligence agencies say they have in intelligence information.
Believable.
In September 2019, 3 people at the Wuhan Institute of Virology became very seriously ill, some kind of respiratory disease. Now, it looks like it was COVID-19, but it could also have been very severe influenza. They favor COVID.
Which leads other epidemiologists and experts to say that probably the outbreak of COVID was much earlier than the Chinese announced. And I know that's been a moving target, but mostly in December, correct?
That's right. I mean, there's no reason it shouldn't have come earlier. And September sort of seems a reasonable date.
I also read in this letter that has now been publicly put out by scientists calling for a new investigation by the World Health Organization, that they staff tested negative for SARS-CoV-2 antibodies at the Wuhan Institute in March 2020. Yet statistically, roughly less than 1 chance in a billion, given that there's more than 590 staff and students at the Institute, and about 4.4% of the Wuhan urban population tested positive around that time, even if only 85 people were tested, the chance of a no positive test result would be less than 4%. So,
right. The Chinese got too clever there.
Yeah, that really calls into question as to what the Chinese government was coming clean on and what it wasn't. The other part of the puzzle that you lay out very well is that one of the explanations from the very beginning was that you can tell through gene splicing, I believe, that if anybody's been messing around with a virus or creating a virus, and that didn't show up here. But the science of that was probably misstated, and that there are many ways that you could play or engineer a virus without the old ways of understanding clearly that had been done. So you can probably put that a little more concisely than I can.
Well, you said it very, very well. And this was a letter in the journal Nature Medicine, which was very influential because it was a group of quite well-known virologists saying it is clear that the virus was not being manipulated. But no one could tell that because, as you mentioned, the way you in fact manipulate those viruses today is not in the old way, which did leave telltale marks. It's in various other ways which don't leave any marks. In fact, the best way to get a virus to attack a human cells, you take it from an animal and you get it to infect, say, humanized mice. And most of the time, the viruses can't do it. They all die. But, to 1 in a billion will have a sort of lucky mutation that lets it sort of mildly infect humanized mice. So then you take the progeny of that virus and you put them again into mice. It's called serial passage. Forgive me while I close this phone.
It's called serial passage.
Serial passage. So you just keep moving the virus from one culture or animals to the next, and what you end up with is a virus very well adapted to attack human cells. And what's happened is that a natural selection has done all the heavy lifting. And there's no way, by looking at that virus, that you can tell whether that happened through natural evolution in the wild or through a virologist doing serial passage in a lab. So this very influential letter in Nature Medicine was assuring the public of something that the writers could not possibly know.
Could it have been a bioweapon?
I didn't think so. There's no evidence of that. I mean, what is possible, and we certainly don't know this for sure, is that there was sort of some military virology efforts going on in the background, and very, very possibly they were directed toward creating a vaccine against coronaviruses. And this is not particularly sinister. I think it's what our military would do if they found some quite dangerous virus that was sort of at large in the population.
In fact, they are doing it and do it routinely.
So
it's try to get ahead of these viruses for soldiers, because apparently in the Spanish flu there were more soldiers killed by the Spanish flu than the war at the time. Yeah,
of course, you need to protect your own forces. So I don't see, if there were military involvement, I don't see any particular scandal there.
Something else you mentioned, hospitals receiving the early patients are clustered around the Wuhan #2 subway line, which connects the Institute of Virology at one end with the international airport at the other.
Right.
Is that a pretty critical piece of evidence here?
Well, it's a very interesting finding. It needs to be confirmed because I think it hasn't been published in a journal yet.
That was by Stephen Quay, a physician researcher who's applied statistical and bioinformatic tools to ingenious explorations of the virus's origin.
Yes, very ingenious. I mean, he looked at all the hospitals in Wuhan to which the first patients were taken, and he found that all the hospitals were near subway stops on the #2 subway line in Wuhan, which is interesting because at one end of it is the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and at the other end is the international airport. So if lab workers at the institute had got infected and were commuting on the #2 subway line, this is sort of perfect conveyor belt for distributing the virus to the rest of the world, which of course is just what happened.
There are so many people reading your essay, and so many people who are calling for further investigations by the World Health Organization, because I think now there is beginning to be, and I should be careful how I characterize it, is there a consensus? I don't know. But there is certainly a large number of former defense, biological experts, the scientific community, analysts like yourself who really think that all roads lead to the Wuhan lab. I'll ask you the obvious. Why is it important now that we really understand where COVID-19 originated and whether it did indeed come from gain of function experiments in that lab?
Well, I think we really need to know, because of the policies that would follow from the two possibilities. I mean, if it came from the lab, we need to, make sure we take a very hard look at gain of function experiments all around the world,
which were banned in the United States at a certain point, right? And then another presidential administration came in and then allowed them to take place again. And gain of function are done in parts of Europe, just not only Asia.
Right, they were under a U.S. moratorium from 2014 to 2017.
Yes.
And it's a very interesting question, maybe a whole other story as to why the U.S. government continues to fund the work at the Wuhan Institute of Virology throughout this moratorium and thereafter. But in any case, if the virus really did escape from the lab, then we need to take a very hard look at all gain of function experiments. If it did not escape from the lab, if it came from natural emergence, then we double our efforts to find the sources of these viruses.
Where do you think we're left here with the Chinese government? They're not going to supply all the records in the lab. They're not allowing even journalists to go to the cave to investigate the origins of this. Without a coming clean, because they don't want to accept responsibility for sparking a pandemic. The World Health Organization is discredited to some degree in its initial investigation. Are we ever going to get to the bottom of this? Or do you think we're kind of there now?
I think we're at one bottom right now, which is we probably got all the information, all the scientific information we're going to get until or unless the Chinese, as you say, come clean. But I think there's a very interesting fallback position you can envisage for them, which is to say, okay, we did have an accident in our lab, just like you do in the West and every place else. But look, who funded this research? It was the American government. So it's just our bad luck that the accident took place on our soil is really a sort of a global problem. I think they might sort of play, you can imagine them playing that card if there's a sufficient storm of protest in the West, if their cover-up story falls apart, if people start to sort of see the obvious, that it's much more probable the virus came from their lab. If you put enough pressure on them, I think you might sort of generate internal pressures in China, because their scientists are just like ours. Some of them are honest and would like the truth to come out. You might generate depression in which this fallback position becomes preferable from them. And then, of course, everyone would be much further ahead. It would just establish a degree of trust between China and the West, and we could all start on a new leaf if that isn't too Panglossian. However, it's not going to happen soon, that's for sure.
Certainly more plausible than the frozen food imported suggestion that they've been floating. Whatever spin doctor spun that needs a new job. But look, Nicholas, thank you so much. Great piece and amazing research, and we really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for your interest.
And now a letter from 24 scientists around the world has been released demanding a new investigation into the origins of COVID and demanding that the World Health Organization look into the lab in Wuhan. Gilles Demaneuf is in New Zealand. Hi, Gilles.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Look, this is such an interesting letter because it goes much further than just demanding a new investigation, but it lays the groundwork in terms of why denials by the Chinese that this lab could have been involved in any way sound pretty hollow when you take a look at some of the facts. Would you agree?
Yes, I mean, some of the facts we're listing there, and we've done an awful lot of research, over something like 10 months now. Some of the facts are fairly obvious. I mean, at best shows that there's some withdrawal of information, sometimes blatant lies too. And that's not really conducive to, things that they're very honest about what they're telling us, without prejudice to what the exact origins are. Certainly the attitude is not really consistent with what we would expect, especially since there are now 3 million deaths,
All right, you're not a geneticist, you're not a epidemiologist, but you are a data analyst from a group now called DRASTIC, which, as I understand, is an international team of scientists and sleuths attempting to fill in gaps on COVID's origins. What is the background on DRASTIC? How did this get going?
Let's say that, first of all, yes, I'm a member of DRASTIC. I'm a member too of what's called the Paris group. And where we're quite different from anybody in both the DRASTIC and the Paris group is that we are actually, we've got people from very different backgrounds. And for what we're suggesting here, which is really a forensic investigation of the potential of a lab-related accident, you need people from very different backgrounds. My side, and I'm not the only one in DRASTIC, my side is more data analysis, getting the data out, finding where the data is, making sense of it. It's pretty much like a standard intelligence or SINT analyst. Basically, you go find the data. Most of it is just available on your Chinese internet if you know how to find it. And you translate it, you look at it, you compile it, and you make hypotheses. And obviously, eventually, you publish your research and you put it out there for discussion.
Let's talk about data, because what's important in terms of you being able to assess and access data is the fact that the Chinese had this lab in Wuhan, which was for most of the time was online, I understand, before COVID broke out, and their sampling of bat viruses and what they were doing with them was at one point public. What happened to that?
It wasn't fully public. Let's say they had a database, actually they had 15 databases, and one was a big one, the main one was very important. And these databases are a private and a public portion. The public portion was typically viruses and samples that they felt was okay to actually render public, but they had a private section, and the private section was typically for what they were working on. Especially they didn't want people to actually look at what they were working on or what they could still work on and go and write their own papers. So, I mean, scientists are like this. They're not going to give their raw materials that they went and, sampled in some mine or other places. So
but is this the one that had 22,000 samples and virus?
Exactly. So some of them were public because they already published about them, or it was okay for them to release them. But, at all time, they had a section which was private. And that private section, you had to ask a permission. You had to ask a very specific question to them, typically to Xi Zhengli, and ask, okay, can I access the data? What do you have there? And maybe they would let you know what they have there. But typically, scientists do not want someone to come in, look at what they have, write a paper, and run away with the papers. That's not the way.
Okay. If you had the password,
yeah, you needed basically a password. So all these new viruses that they sort of were working on, typically anyway, were not made public. They were in the private section. But a lot of things were still made public because they had published about it, or they thought it was okay to actually, release it. But what happened effectively in September 2019, actually on the 12th of September 2019, is that database, which actually had been funded partly by the European community under a product called EVAG, that database just was taken offline. And that's it. And all the 15 databases, part of that family of databases, were taken offline. Today, there's nothing left of any of the data of the WIV. Nothing is online. It's all gone.
It doesn't mean it's gone, but it's not online.
It's not online. You can't access it. They're not going to tell you when they're going to release it. They're just telling you, because they're just telling you that some hackers were basically trying to get to the database, so they took it offline. And that makes no sense, because when they said that, they said it was during, they had to take it offline during the pandemics, but actually they took it offline.
22,000 samples of virus sequences, including 15,000 from bats, and covered 1,400 bat viruses, is taken offline in September. This is months before COVID is officially announced by the Chinese in terms of their cases in December. Is that by itself a little suspicious?
Well, it certainly is a bit odd. Now, you have to, when you look at, it's all about data. You collect the facts, you collect the information, and you try to interpret it. Sometimes it's better not to try to push it too far. I mean, in this case, maybe there was some good reason for them to take it off. Possibly. That's possible, but I cannot conclude that today. What is sure is that they never put it back. And, about 3 million people dead. Everybody wants to have access to this to actually check it out. You don't have access. I mean, that's the basic stuff you would ask, is that, okay, give us access. Put it on a USB drive if you want, if you're afraid that someone is going to hack it.
I don't want to go too far down this conspiracy idea with the Chinese in this database. But what's important here, in order to understand it in context, is that they are doing experiments in this lab that involve coronavirus sampling and sequencing, and they are at one point strengthening those viruses in their experiments. And now people want to know, well, did that lead you to COVID-19? Show us your data. Show us what you were doing inside the lab. The database has been taken offline and that information has disappeared.
Yeah, there's that. But remember, too, that what are the Chinese telling us today? They're telling us that we've got to go and sample. We've got to go and sample in Thailand, in other countries and everywhere. But let's just think about it. They already have a lot of samples available in that database, and they're not public. So before they tell us to go and sample, why don't they just show us what they have in the database? I mean, that's not very difficult,
Why didn't the WHO ask for that and demand that? And how could the WHO come to a conclusion that it was unlikely that the lab was involved in the outbreak of COVID-19? How can they come to that conclusion?
That's a different issue. You need to look very objectively just at the facts that you see. I mean, we see a database that has been taken offline. We see a database which is essential for understanding what's going on. We see the WHO and China saying we need to go and sample. So all I have to say, well, before we go and sample, show us what you have in that database. We know, by the way, that there are a family of about 8 viruses in that database sequence, which are very close to actually RAT-TG13, the closest virus known to date to SARS-CoV-2. So, I mean, we already know we have very close viruses there, very close to SARS-CoV-2 in a way. Why don't you just show us what you have? What's the point of going to Thailand, spend 10 years to try to get something which may never be as close as that? Just show us what you have in the database. It's just common sense. Now, what happened during the sort of visit of the joint team in Wuhan is that basically, very simply, Peter Daszak just told the teams that he knew what was in the database, and there was no point looking at it. Only problem, he said that the database was actually an Excel spreadsheet. No, I just don't know. You can put sequences which are 10,000 letters long into a spreadsheet. It makes no sense whatsoever. You don't. I mean, you need.
All right, this is Peter.
Information system.
You're referring.
Let's
stop here. Let's stop for a second. You're referring to Peter Daszak.
Yes, that's
involved in the WHO investigation, and he's also involved in Lancet's COVID-19 commission. These are the only 2 investigations now that are running a year and a half after the outbreak of a world pandemic. And he was involved in funding this lab from the United States. He was involved in funding this lab.
Yes, he wasn't the only one.
Some would argue he has a very severe conflict of interest in being involved in any investigation of the lab.
Well, I think that's correct. But, I mean, people will tell you that, most virologists today would have a conflict of interest in one way or another, because the fact is that most of the cutting edge research was being done in Wuhan on coronaviruses, for the simple reasons that basically, for a few years, they couldn't do it in the States and anywhere else. So basically, the same way that we export, a lot of our stuff to be done in China, then that research was done in China, but with money from the U.S. taxpayers. So
these are gain of function experiments.
Well, gain of function is one way, but it started maybe not with gain of function. It started with traditional research, and it moved into effectively the latest grants were effectively in 2018-19 were effectively very explicitly moving towards gain of function. But once again, this is not just Peter Daszak that decided to go and do that. It's the NIH which decided to go and do that, and I was done with U.S. taxpayers' money because we offloaded, the U.S. basically offloaded its research to China on that. That's very clear. And yes, there's certainly a conflict of interest there. I mean, you could say, but there are 2 ways of defining a conflict of interest. One is a theoretical conflict of interest. The other one is a very practical and realized conflict of interest. And I think that when someone goes and says that, the database is fine because actually it's an Excel spreadsheet and there's nothing to look at, there's nothing in it of any interest, especially when he has no access to the sort of portion which was password protected anyway. And when it's not an Excel spreadsheet, because you can't ever put all that data in a structured way in an Excel spreadsheet anyway, it makes no sense whatsoever. That someone says something like this in such an investigation for me is a bit surprising. And I may ask, is that a theoretical conflict of interest or a realized conflict of interest?
In the letter, you are not only asking for access to the lab, but you want access to the Mojang mine, where in April 2012, there 6 men contract severe pneumonia with COVID-19-like symptoms. They are sent to hospital. 3 of them eventually die. And those lab samples then are worked on in the Wuhan lab. Is that correct?
That's correct. So what happened is that 2 died quite early. And after the second one died, they called Zhongnan Chan, which is basically still and was at the time the specialist for any unknown pneumonia of unknown cause. He was the hero of SARS. And they called him in. And he ordered effectively that the 4 patients that were still alive, one of them for not very long, but the 4 patients that were still alive, he ordered them to be tested. And some of the tests were done effectively at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. and actually they came back positive for IgG, basically, which means past infection with some coronavirus.
With some coronavirus.
Yes. So
and where is that information now, and the sequencing that was done in the lab with that information afterwards? Because that seems to be a smoking gun in this.
Well, it's not. Doesn't mean sequencing was done. A test was done, and they got little sort of receptors which actually match the target in this case. That would be the SARS-like coronavirus, and that basically tested positive. To go back to your question, this is again a case of, the WHO and China is saying we need to go and sample. And China is saying, well, let's go and sample in Thailand and East Asia and so on. But if you look at it, actually, where are, again, the closest virus to SARS-CoV-2? Well, they're all from that mine. So before we go in Thailand, why don't we go back to the mine? I mean, the first thing
back to the mine where many coronavirus samples were collected from, and where
all the
there is a documented outbreak.
Where all the closest ones are. I mean, if someone gets killed at the corner of your street, you're not going to go, to another city to actually look for, clues. You go back to the corner of the street. I mean, that's fairly logical, yeah? So,
here's something else in your letter, which is very striking. Something else in your letter, which is very striking, says that staff at the Wuhan labs were all tested negative for COVID-19, for SARS-CoV-2 antibodies. Statistically, you say that this is unlikely, given that there were more than 590 staff and students at the lab, and about 4.4% of the Wuhan urban population test positive around that time. This is during the outbreak of COVID. Even if only 85 people were tested, the chance of no positive test would still be less than 4%. How can the contradiction be explained? So you're saying you believe what? That people indeed had tested positive in the lab and the Chinese don't want to say it?
Well, let me tell you, because the Chinese have been very careful not to say exactly anything precise so that you can't actually pin them. So they never said how many people were actually tested. It's very vague. So the best you'll find is in some declaration, they say students and staff at the WIFE have been tested. They all came back negative. In some of the declarations, they say students and staff in Xizhengli unit were tested. And in another declaration, they say students and staff in 4 labs they went to or visited or talked to were tested, and they all came back negative. So basically, it's very difficult to actually understand what they're saying. The fact is, if you want to actually look at the possibilities that someone got infected in that lab, and given that it's an airborne, virus, very easily, I mean, if for example, one of the filters in the lab was out of service, anybody downwind from that lab could get infected. So really what you need to do is to actually sample everybody, not just the team where Xizhengli was, but everybody in the lab, the students, even the temporary workers, because we know that some temporary workers were only 15 meters downwind from the lab, 15 meters downwind from the lab. There are barracks down there for temporary workers. So everybody down there really should be tested, okay? Now, if you take it to the maximum, which is about 590, the chance of negative, given the prevailing effectively occurrence of COVID-19 at the time, which was 4.4% according to Chinese papers. The probability of nobody testing positive is about 1 in 1/10 of a billion. Okay, it's mathematical.
1/10 of a billion.
Yes.
Wow.
That's mathematical. It's what's called a binomial, basically, distribution. I won't go into the details, but if you crunch the numbers, it's about 1/10 of a billion. No, and you can look at it, okay, so maybe they were a bit lazy, they didn't do the right job, they just tested, 20 is there, maybe a few more, and maybe, so I say maybe 80 people, effectively, that's a bit lazy, that's not good enough, they should do a better job. But even if they tested 80 people, the chances of nobody testing positive is around 3.5%, less than 4%. Now, not only it's still very small, But in any case, they wouldn't have tested correctly. They should have tested more people. There are many scenarios, by the way. It's not just, it can actually be what's called a lab-acquired infection, meaning someone in the lab, someone directly in a lab doing the experiments. If there was an experiment, it could be someone in an area which is common. That happened in Beijing. Some people got infected. They were not directly working with SARS at the time, but they were sharing premises with people, working on SARS. So you have to test, quite generally. You have to test even downwind, because, even if there's, let's say, liquid waste or, problem with drainage, you need to test around. You need to test all the teams that went and actually sampled in these in Mojiang and elsewhere. So actually, there's quite a few people to sample, to test. Really, that would be the first thing you would be doing normally if you were doing things seriously. You would actually list everybody who's gone to sampling in a wild. You would be listing everybody who's been present in a lab, and you would test everybody.
What do you make of? Let me ask you another thing. What do you make of Stephen Quay, a physician researcher? Do you know him?
Yes, I know him. Yeah. Sure.
So he has done a study now, statistical study, which shows hospitals receiving the early patients of COVID-19 in China are all clustered along the subway line number 2. And that is relevant because that subway line runs from the Wuhan lab to the airport. What do you make of that?
And close to the market too.
And close to the market.
It crosses the river and across Wuhan.
Okay.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. If you remember what happened, let's say with SARS, public transport is usually a huge facilitators of infection. So usually, if you really want to try to understand the dynamics, you look at public transport and you look at places where people, are very tight together, like a market, especially Chinese markets, like wet markets in China. I don't know whether you've been to any, but I think it's quite tight. It's quite tight. There's not much sun. It's very humid. There's water everywhere, and there's a lot of people there, and it's not very clean. So these are the places where people will move in and out, and that's typically effectively what could spark a proper infection. So I think it makes a lot of sense, effectively, that maybe the line number 2 played a role, and it could explain why, effectively, eventually the virus spread to that market. Now, I think we know since February 2020 that the market most likely is not where it started. It's just a place where it was amplified. There was actually a very interesting paper published on 22nd of February 2020 by actually a Chinese team, which actually just said that. It just said, actually it's not from the market, cannot be from the market. So actually we know that for more than a year now. There's nothing new there. Within less than 2 months, people already had concluded it couldn't be from the market, or most likely it wasn't from the market. So yes, line number 2 would certainly have could have played a major role. And it certainly points to the potential of emergence further down south, maybe closer to the WIV, maybe closer to one of the PLA military hospitals, which is one of the hypotheses that Dr. Quay has been mentioning quite a bit, because he's also found that actually the early specific viruses, the earliest one, were not actually at the market. They seem to be coming back to cases which were treated in that military hospital.
What does that tell us if they had early cases treated at a military hospital?
Well, Dr. Quay actually found some interesting things there, which actually seems to show that the military hospital was actually effectively treating early cases. So that wouldn't, we're talking about collecting data and trying to make sense of it. The first thing we have is to collect the data. The interpretation is always something that can be discussed, and people may say, well, it's just, coincidence, whatever. But the fact is, there's data that shows effectively that some early cases, very early cases, with certainly the precursor of the actual virus, or the earliest one we know, certainly go back to that military hospital. So that could make sense. If you believe that effectively there were cases in November, as the US intelligence services have been saying, if you believe that 3 people, for example, at the lab, technicians, as the lab fell ill, as was disclosed some time ago, then yes, it could make sense. But that's one interpretation. That's one way of putting things together.
You're talking 1 month before the Chinese officially announced it in December that they had cases in November.
Well, actually, the Chinese never really actually acknowledged that they had cases in November. The Chinese have put a rule, and the rule that they put in place is that there's no case in November. They will never tell you there's a case in November. They will never, for the simple reason that if they did so, then there's stories that it started, in Spain, in France, in the UK, or in Italy, or wherever, and just basically ended up in Wuhan. All that story obviously would be proved very clearly to be complete nonsense.
The Chinese also would say that people like you, are just trying to cook up some conspiracy against them. And that they have cooperated with the WHO, and they have been, I guess they might say they've been open and transparent, and that the origins of COVID came from another country, maybe in frozen food. You've been working on this for a year or more?
Yeah, yes.
What do you say? I mean, what's realistic?
The reality is that I think nobody really believes that they were exactly transparent. I think Dr. Tedros, basically Director General of the WHO, himself said he was very disappointed that there was not the access that is needed to the data. And once again, this is about data. Myself, I'm a data analyst. I believe in data. Give me the data. That's all I ask for. Expert opinion with the data is nothing. When someone, writes a letter and tells you, oh, we believe, that this, has been done in Lancet or somewhere else, that's expert opinion with that data. It's worth nothing. Okay? It's worth nothing. You have to have data. Expert opinion with that data is nothing. Let's go and get the data. That's what DRASTIC has done for, a year now. We go and get the data, and we actually show the data. We work from data. And we don't have, what we would like to see is effectively the real data about the cases in November. We know that it exists because the South China Morning Post actually saw it and reported about it. And there were 9 cases which were confirmed in November. The first one on the 17th, but not the only one. There were 4 men, 5 women. There were from, I think, 39 or 36 to 70 something, so quite aged people, which means, and that these are the ones who ended in hospital. So realistically, there's about at least 6 to 10 times more people who got infected. So in November, there would have been at least 60 people already infected. And we know that. Everybody knows that. Even Peter and Barrick basically pointed to that reality, is that there must be November cases. The problem is that China basically would rather cut, both its legs rather than say that there are cases in November. But it's a charade. I think everybody knows there must be cases in November.
It's a charade. Okay. Where do you think this ends? I mean, you've called on the Chinese to provide the data. There are many more people who are saying, look, this story doesn't float. There has to be more experimentation from that lab that you need to come clean on. You need to show us what you did in the lab. The Chinese, have put up a wall on all of this. But, slowly it seems like the noose is tightening in the sense that evidence does trickle out and there is a trail to follow. Yes. And it just doesn't end here with Chinese denials. I mean, the investigations will continue and the demands for transparency will continue.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll get more data. The reality is that, the Chinese are fairly good at removing data, but usually they're a bit behind us. I can tell you, DRASTIC usually find public data and get there and find it, before the Chinese has got a chance to remove it. And you can actually get data, and very interesting one. And I think we can still do a lot on that side. There's still a biological argument where actually researchers are still looking at it from the genome point of view and trying to basically test a few ideas there. So there's that side of the argument, which is more driven by the biological argument, and there's a data-driven argument, which DRASTIC and others have been working on. And there's, you don't need to be in China to get the data. The reality, the WHO joint team in China certainly did what they could with the data they had, and they certainly made some progress, I would say, on the standard zoonosis pathways. But if you want to investigate the lab-related accident pathway, it's better to do it actually from outside China, honestly. You're not going to be able to do much from China.
Gilles Demaneuf, thank you so much for your time. And I have a funny feeling we'll be talking to you again. And I really do appreciate all of your insight and your perspective on this. And a year and a half into a world pandemic, we should know how the hell it started, and we don't know.
We should know. I think that everybody should ask for it. I think we need to put pressure on our governments to actually ask the right questions. We can't just put, 3 million dead under the carpet and pretend it didn't happen. And if we don't actually solve this problem, maybe in 10 years' time or 5 years' time, there'll be SARS 3. And, if nothing is resolved, then it might be even worse. So we have to think about this. Just like, beginning of nuclear energy in the US and in Europe, we make a few mistakes. We basically, have a few problems. Eventually, we solve the problem. I think it's time to solve the issues that we're seeing.
Thank you, Gilles.
Thanks a lot.
The origins of COVID-19. The trail is not cold. It seems to be getting warmer all the time. The Chinese have been unable to shut down increasing demands for more access and information on the Wuhan lab's gain-of-function experiments on coronaviruses. It would be cliche to say we may never know how this pandemic started, because most scientists believe we will get to the bottom of this, despite any attempts to cover it up. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening to Backstory. We ask you to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, and please share it. And I'll talk to you again soon.